The old man's hands went completely still the moment he saw the photograph in my wallet. We were standing in the middle of a Veterans Day reception at the Civic Center in Harrisburg, surrounded by pressed suits and folded flags, and the kind of careful applause people give when they're not sure what else to do. He had just introduced himself as a retired colonel, something about 30 years of service, something about being glad young people still showed up to these things. I wasn't really listening. I was reaching into my wallet for a business card when the photograph slipped out and landed face up on the table between us. It was a picture of my grandfather. The colonel looked down. Then he stopped moving. His hand, which had been extended toward the card, just hovered there in the air. He wasn't looking at my grandfather's face. He was looking at the small, dull-colored patch sewn onto my grandfather's left shoulder in the photo. A patch with no insignia I recognized. No unit number, no branch seal, just a simple shape stitched in olive thread on olive fabric, the kind of thing you might walk past 100 times without noticing. "Where did you get this?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not hostile, not curious the way people are curious about old photographs. Something else, something careful. "That's my grandfather," I said. "He passed away in the spring." The colonel picked up the photograph. He held it close, tilted it slightly toward the light. Then he set it down and looked at me directly for the first time since we'd started talking. His expression had changed in a way I couldn't quite name. "We need to speak privately," he said. "Not here." I had no idea, standing in that room full of speeches and handshakes, that my grandfather had been living a life my family never tried to understand. I had no idea that the man we called difficult, stubborn, and eventually just sad, had spent decades carrying something none of us ever thought to ask about. And I had no idea that a single faded photograph would be the thing that finally told me who he really was. My grandfather, Robert Earl Calloway, lived alone in a 2-story farmhouse outside of Gettysburg for as long as I could remember. He didn't drive much after his 70s, didn't come to holidays unless someone drove out to get him, and didn't ask for anything from anyone in a way that made it easy to forget he needed things at all. That was the problem with him, my father always said. He made it too easy to leave him alone. My father wasn't a cruel man. He was just a man who had learned early that his own father didn't offer explanations, and somewhere along the way he had decided that meant there was nothing worth explaining. My grandfather worked on cars in the garage. He kept a garden nobody ate from. He went to the VFW hall in town on Thursday evenings and came home before dark, and when my mother once asked him what they talked about out there, he said, "Not much." That was his whole personality as far as my family was concerned. Not much. My mother tried harder than my father did. In the early years, she would bring him soup when he got sick. She remembered his birthday when my father forgot. But she had her own parents to worry about, her own exhaustions. And my grandfather had a way of receiving kindness so quietly that after a while it felt like he was declining it. He never called her by her first name. He never asked about her work or her friends. He listened politely, and then the conversation ended and nothing had been exchanged. She told me once, years later, that being around him was like talking into a room where the lights were off. You couldn't tell if anyone was home. So they stopped trying. Not all at once, not with any decision they ever spoke out loud. Just gradually, the way people stop calling someone back when the calls never go anywhere. I was the one who kept going out there. Even as a kid, I didn't fully understand why. There was something about the farmhouse, about the way the light came through the kitchen window in the late afternoon, about the way he made coffee like it was a serious undertaking. He would sit across from me at the table and not say much, but it didn't feel empty the way it did to my mother. It felt like something was happening underneath, like if I sat still long enough, something would surface. It never did. Not while he was alive. He died on a Tuesday in March. His neighbor found him in the garden, which was where he had wanted to be, I think. He had been tending to something in the far corner near the stone wall, and he had simply sat down in the dirt and not gotten up again. The neighbor called an ambulance. By the time I arrived, he was already gone. My father came to the funeral. My mother came. My brother sent flowers and a card because he was in Atlanta, and the drive was long and the notice was short. 3 people from the VFW hall came, men I didn't know, who stood at the back and didn't speak to anyone. One of them, a thin man with a hearing aid and a Vietnam veteran cap, looked at the closed casket for a long time before he left. We buried my grandfather in the church cemetery 2 miles from the farmhouse. No military honors, because we hadn't thought to arrange them. No flag. The priest said what priests say, and the whole thing was over in 40 minutes. And then my father and I drove back to the farmhouse to begin sorting through things, because the estate would need to be settled, and no one had time to do this twice. Most of what we found was ordinary. Old furniture, old tools, boxes of Reader's Digest from the 1980s. My father moved through the rooms with the focused efficiency of a man who wanted to be finished by dinner. I moved more slowly. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Something, I thought. Some version of him I hadn't been able to find while he was alive. In the upstairs bedroom, inside a cardboard box tucked behind a row of winter coats in the closet, I found a small canvas roll tied with a bootlace. The kind of thing a person uses to store chisels or brushes. When I unrolled it on the bed, what came out wasn't tools. There were 4 items. A folded sheet of paper with handwriting I didn't recognize. A small laminated card with no name on it, just a number and a date and a government seal I couldn't identify. A black and white photograph of 6 young men in field gear, none of them smiling, standing in a landscape that looked like Korea, and one of those men was my grandfather. I had never seen a photograph of my grandfather in uniform before. My father said he didn't have any. The 4th item was a piece of cloth, a uniform patch, small, olive-colored, with the same shape stitched on it that would later freeze a colonel in place at a reception in Harrisburg. I didn't know what it meant. I put everything back in the canvas roll and brought it home with me, and I put it in a drawer, and I didn't think about it again for 4 months. The photograph was in my wallet because I had meant to get it copied and framed, and I kept forgetting, and so it just stayed there. I didn't bring it to the reception on purpose. Things rarely happen on purpose in the way that matters. The colonel's name was Gerald Marsh. He had served 31 years, most of it in intelligence-adjacent roles that he described in vague, careful language, the kind of language people use when they know more than they're saying. He had asked me to step into a side hallway off the main reception room, and we stood there with the sound of the event muffled behind us, and he held the photograph again in both hands. "Your grandfather was part of a unit that doesn't exist in any official record," he said. "Not Army, not specifically. Something older, and something quieter." He explained it the way someone explains a thing they have rehearsed in their head for years but never expected to actually say out loud. During the Korean War, and for some years afterward, certain men were selected not for physical strength or combat skill but for intelligence, for patience, for the ability to disappear into a situation. They were placed in country, not as soldiers but as presences, gathering, observing, sometimes facilitating the exit of people who needed to leave quietly. There were no official designations, no citations. The unit functioned on the principle that if it worked, it had never existed, and if it failed, the same was true. "The patch," he said, "identified them to each other. Not to command, not to the enemy, to each other." I stared at him. "And you recognized it." "I served with someone who wore it once," he said. "A long time ago. I asked him about it and he told me exactly what I just told you, and then he never mentioned it again. I didn't know what to do with any of this." I thanked him, took his contact information, and drove home feeling the way you feel when a story you've been living inside suddenly reveals that it had a different shape all along. I called my father that night. He was eating dinner. I could hear the television in the background. I told him what the colonel had said. There was a pause, and then he said, "That sounds like something your grandfather would invent to feel important." "Dad," I said. A retired colonel recognized his patch. "Your grandfather watched a lot of war movies," my father said. "He could have gotten that patch anywhere." I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The thing I kept coming back to wasn't the patch or the colonel or the unit that didn't exist. It was the box in the closet. The way it was hidden, not locked, not buried, just placed carefully behind things, wrapped in something that took a little effort to undo. The way you put something when you want to make sure it's found by the right person and not accidentally thrown away. I went back to the farmhouse the following weekend. My father had arranged for an estate sale company to take most of the furniture, and the rooms were half empty in a way that made everything feel both larger and smaller at the same time. I walked the house slowly, the way I had after the funeral, and this time I went looking for the thing I hadn't looked for before. In the kitchen, behind a loose board under the sink that I only noticed because the linoleum curled up at that corner, I found a second canvas roll. Inside this one, More photographs, more names, written on the backs in pencil. A folded map of a part of the Korean peninsula with routes marked in red, and a small envelope with my name on it. Not my father's name. Mine. I had not been back to that house since I was 24. My grandfather had addressed this envelope to me more than a decade before he died, which meant he had written it when I was still a teenager, coming out to sit in his kitchen on Sunday afternoons. He had been waiting for me to find it. Or waiting to see if I would. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. He wrote that there were parts of his life he had made a decision to keep separate from his family, not because he was ashamed of them, but because the people who knew would have been put at risk by loose words, and the people who didn't know would have been burdened by them. He wrote that he understood this had made him difficult to love. He wrote that of everyone in his family, I was the only one who ever sat with him without wanting him to be something else, and that was why he was writing this to me. He wrote, "The work I did was not important because anyone knew about it. It was important because of what it protected. Some of those people are still alive. That is enough." And then, at the bottom, "If you ever meet someone who recognizes the patch, tell them Thomas sends his regards. They will know what that means." I read the letter 4 times, standing in the kitchen where he had made coffee like it was a serious undertaking. Then I sat down on the floor and cried for the first time since he died. I called Colonel Marsh the next morning. I told him about the letter. There was a long silence on his end. "Thomas," he said quietly. That was his call name. I never knew his real first name until right now. We met 3 days later at a diner outside of Harrisburg. He brought a man with him, older, maybe 80, who walked with a cane and wore a hearing aid and looked at me when he sat down like he was checking whether I was real. "This is Raymond," the colonel said. "He served with your grandfather." Raymond reached across the table and shook my hand very formally. Then he said, "You look like him around the eyes." I didn't know that. Nobody had ever told me I looked like my grandfather. Raymond spoke slowly, the way men his age sometimes do when they've learned that words matter. He told me that my grandfather had been one of 6 men in their unit, that they had operated primarily along the northern border during and after the armistice, doing work that he described only as logistics, the kind of word that covers a great deal when used by someone who knows what it covered. He said my grandfather had been the calmest man he ever met in a difficult situation. He said that in 30 years of service after Korea, he had never met another man who could make himself invisible the way Robert Calloway could. Not physically, Raymond said. Psychologically. He could be in a room full of people paying attention and not one of them would remember him afterward. It wasn't a trick. It was just the way he was built. I thought about my mother saying it felt like talking into a room where the lights were off. "He used that," I said. "Every single day," Raymond said. And when he came home and everyone expected him to be different, to talk about it, to bring it back into regular life, he just kept doing what he'd always done. He stayed quiet, and people decided that meant there was nothing there. I asked why no one had recognized him when he died, why there had been no honors, no acknowledgement, no letter from anyone in the government. Raymond looked at the table. "Because officially, he was never there," he said. "The Army has no record of that unit. We weren't carried on any roster. We weren't a division or a company or even a squad on paper. We were something that happened between the lines of the official story and then got folded away." I thought about my father saying that the estate needed to be settled and there was no time to do this twice. I thought about my grandfather sitting in his garden in the late afternoon with no one coming to check on him. I thought about him writing my name on an envelope and waiting to see if I would find it. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. I brought the canvas rolls, the photographs, the map, and the letter. I sat down at the kitchen table with both of them, and I laid everything out. My father picked up one of the photographs. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. In the picture, my grandfather was maybe 23 years old. He had the same posture he'd had at 80, that particular stillness Raymond had described. Around the eyes, I could see what the old man had meant. "He never said anything," my father said. "It was not an accusation. It was something else. The voice of a man who has just realized that a door he ignored for 40 years had something behind it. He wasn't supposed to," I said. "That was the condition. That was the entire point." My mother was reading the letter. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. "He wrote your name," she said softly. "Not ours." "I know," I said. She looked up. "He knew." "He knew," I said. My father set the photograph down very carefully. The way you set something down when you're afraid that if you're not careful it will break or disappear. I called him difficult, he said. I didn't answer. I told you he invented stories to feel important. I still didn't answer. He was 23 years old, my father said, looking at the photograph again. And he was doing things in Korea that he couldn't tell his own son about for the rest of his life. He paused, and I decided he was making it up. My mother reached across the table and put her hand on my father's arm. He didn't move for a moment. Then he pressed his hand over hers. He sat in that house by himself, he said, for years. I know, I said. I didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say that would help. The conversation that followed was long and not easy. My mother cried more than once. My father didn't cry, but there were moments when he stopped speaking mid-sentence and looked at his hands. My brother called from Atlanta during this, and my mother put him on speaker, and I explained what I had found. And there was a long silence from Atlanta before he said, I remember the last time I saw him. He asked if I could come down and help him fix the roof on the garage. I told him I'd come the next time I was in the area. He said, sure, no rush. I never went. Nobody said much after that for a while. 3 weeks later, we held a second service at the church cemetery. Not because anyone asked us to. Not because there was a protocol for it. Just because my father said he needed to stand at that grave with something other than the 40 minutes we had given it in March. Colonel Marsh came. Raymond came, which surprised me, because the drive was long for a man his age with a cane. 2 other men came who I didn't know, both old, both carrying themselves with the quiet uprightness of people who have lived at a permanent angle to the official version of things. They didn't introduce themselves by name, and I didn't ask. My father stood at the graveside and said something I didn't expect from him. He said he had spent most of his life believing that a man who didn't talk about himself was a man who had nothing to say. He said he had been wrong about that in the most complete way a person could be wrong about something. He said he was sorry for the holidays my grandfather spent alone, for the calls that didn't happen, for every time someone at a family table had made a joke about the old man who just sat there and didn't say much. He said, I didn't know you. I should have tried harder to know you. I'm going to have to live with that. My mother had brought flowers, real ones, from a garden, not a florist, because she had remembered that my grandfather always preferred things that had come from actual dirt. She set them against the headstone carefully, and for a moment she looked like the person she had been when she still came out to bring him soup. Raymond stood at the back and didn't speak during the service. Afterward, when everyone was beginning to drift toward the parking lot, he made his way to the grave and stood there alone for a few minutes. I didn't approach him. Some things need their own space. On the drive home, my father asked me if I was still wearing the patch. I had sewn it onto the inside of my jacket pocket after I found the canvas roll, close but not visible, the way my grandfather had always carried things. I'm keeping it, I said. He nodded. Good, he said. Then, after a moment, he'd want someone to have it. The months after that were quieter than the months before. My parents began talking about my grandfather in a way they never had, not as a grievance or a complication, but with a kind of careful curiosity, like people turning over something they've been stepping around and finally looking at what's underneath. My father started going to the VFW hall in town on Thursday evenings, not to talk. He said he just sat and listened. He called me one night to tell me that one of the men there, a man he'd seen a dozen times without really seeing him, had served in the Pacific in 1944 and still woke up certain nights unable to explain to his wife what was wrong. My father said he had sat next to this man for an hour and learned more about him in that hour than he had in 15 years of nodding hello. I didn't know his name, my father said. Can you imagine that? 15 years. I told him I could imagine it. I went back to Gettysburg in October, when the leaves were down and the light was the particular gray of Pennsylvania in fall. I drove out to the farmhouse, which had been sold by then. The new owners had repainted it a color I didn't recognize and put a different mailbox at the end of the driveway, and the garden in the far corner near the stone wall was gone, cleared and smoothed over, ready for something else. I parked at the edge of the road and sat for a minute looking at the house. It didn't look like the same place, but the stone wall was still there, and the angle of the afternoon light through the trees was the same it had always been. And I thought about all the afternoons I had sat at that kitchen table while something passed underneath the surface that I couldn't name. I understood now what it was. It was a man who had spent decades practicing the particular discipline of being present without being visible, of caring without requiring acknowledgement, of leaving things better than he found them without ever telling anyone what he had done. My family had called that stubbornness. They had called it secretiveness and isolation, and eventually just sadness. It wasn't any of those things. I drove to the cemetery before I left. The headstone my father had replaced the temporary marker with was simple. His name, his years, and the words my father had chosen. He carried what we could not see. No rank, no branch, no mention of the unit that didn't exist. Just the truth of him, stated plainly. The way he would have wanted. I put my hand on the stone for a moment. The October cold had moved all the way into the granite. I have thought about him differently since then. I think about what it costs a person to do important work in complete silence for an entire lifetime, knowing that no one in their immediate life will ever understand what they gave, knowing that the evidence will likely be destroyed, knowing that they will sit at holiday tables while people make polite conversation around them and no one will ask the question that would open everything up. I think about the specific loneliness of that, and I think about how he bore it without bitterness, without performance, without asking anyone to notice. He just kept making the coffee carefully. He kept the garden. He went to the VFW hall on Thursday evenings and sat with other men who understood what it meant to carry something no one else could see. Colonel Marsh sent me a letter in November. He said he was glad the photograph had slipped out of my wallet that evening in Harrisburg. He said some things only resurface when they're supposed to, and that my grandfather had clearly arranged for this one to resurface in his own particular way, through a person he trusted, at the right time. He wrote, "The men from that unit are nearly all gone now. What remains is exactly what your grandfather chose to leave. Not records, not recognition, just the people who are still alive because of what he did, and now you, who finally knows why he was the way he was." I read the letter twice at my kitchen table. Then I folded it and put it in the canvas roll with the other things, and tied the bootlace the way it had been tied when I found it. My father is different now. Not transformed, not the way stories say people transform, just different. He listens more. He asks questions he would have considered unnecessary before. When my grandmother on my mother's side mentioned offhand at Thanksgiving that she had never told anyone about something that had happened when she was young, my father put his fork down and said, "Tell us," and meant it, and waited. My mother saw him do it and glanced across the table at me. I thought about all the Thanksgivings my grandfather spent at the edge of the room, about all the years my father missed the thing right in front of him because he had decided there was nothing there. The world is full of people who carry things quietly, people who help without announcing it, who do their most important work in silence, who don't bring their history to the table because no one ever seemed to want it. They sit at the edges of rooms. They go home early. They answer, "How are you?" with fine and mean something much larger, and no one notices, because noticing takes the kind of effort that can feel, on a busy Tuesday, like more than you have to spare. My grandfather was one of those people. Most of the people I've met at the VFW hall with my father on Thursday evenings are those people. The man with the hearing aid who spent an hour talking to my father in October is one of them. They waited for someone to sit still long enough, for someone to ask the question and mean it, for someone to put the fork down and say, "Tell me," and actually listen. I carry the patch now in the inside pocket of my jacket. Not as a symbol of secrets, not as proof of something, as a reminder to slow down, to look at the quiet ones, to ask, and to actually wait for the answer. Because the most important stories I have ever heard began in exactly the same way, with someone who had stopped expecting to be asked, and someone else who finally asked.